The scalpel trembled in Dr. Marcus Williams' steady hands as the operating room door exploded inward. Black-clad figures poured through the sterile space like ink spilling across white paper. Their automatic weapons trained on the surgical team bent over an 8-year-old girl's exposed heart. "Drop everything, hands up now." The lead officer's voice cracked through the air like thunder, drowning out the steady beeping of life support machines that had been keeping little Amara Henderson alive for the past 3 hours. Dr. Williams's eyes darted from the half-completed cardiac surgery to the red laser dots dancing across his surgical gown. His hands remained poised over the child's chest cavity, where her tiny heart fluttered like a trapped bird. "Officer, I can't stop. She'll die if I move away now. Please, just give me 10 more minutes." The words came out steady, professional, even as sweat beaded on his forehead beneath the surgical lights. "We have reports of organ trafficking in this facility," the SWAT commander barked, his voice distorted by the tactical mask. "You need to step away from that patient immediately." The anesthesiologist, Dr. Sarah Kim, kept her eyes locked on the monitors. "Her vitals are crashing. We have maybe 5 minutes before irreversible brain damage sets in." Her voice carried the weight of 15 years in pediatric surgery, each word carefully measured despite the chaos erupting around them. Down the hall, similar scenes unfolded in 3 other operating rooms. Dr. Janet Rivera was halfway through removing a brain tumor from a 62-year-old grandfather when tactical officers stormed her OR. The patient's son had driven 8 hours from rural Georgia, scraping together money for gas because St. Jude Community Hospital was the only facility within 300 miles that would perform the surgery without requiring a $50,000 deposit up front. The hospital had stood as a beacon of hope in East Atlanta for 23 years. Its founder, Dr. Elijah St. Jude, having mortgaged everything he owned to create a place where medical care was a human right, not a privilege determined by insurance coverage. The walls held photographs of successful surgeries, grateful families, and community health fairs that had saved countless lives in neighborhoods where medical deserts stretched for miles. Dr. Williams had been working in these halls for 8 years, ever since completing his residency at Emory. He could have taken any position at the prestigious private hospitals downtown, but something about Dr. St. Jude's vision had called to him. "We save lives here," the old man had told him during his interview. "Not bank accounts, not shareholders' profits, lives." Now, as armed officers forced him to step back from Amara's open chest, Dr. Williams watched the child's heart rate plummet on the monitors. Her mother sat in the waiting room, having driven up from Macon in a 15-year-old Honda with a cracked windshield, clutching a purse containing exactly $43 and a prayer card from her church. She had been told her daughter's surgery would be covered by the hospital's charity care program, one of the many services that kept St. Jude perpetually on the edge of financial collapse, but morally solvent. The 911 call had come in at 2:47 a.m. from a woman identifying herself as a concerned healthcare worker. "There's illegal organ harvesting happening at St. Jude Community Hospital on Boulevard Street," she'd reported, her voice shaking with what sounded like genuine distress. "They're taking organs from patients without consent. Children are involved. Please, you have to stop them before more people die." Karen Elizabeth Morrison had practiced that call 17 times in her Mercedes-Benz E-Class, parked in the shadows across from the hospital's emergency entrance. She'd watched the patterns of the night shift for weeks, timing her call to coincide with the hospital's busiest surgical hours. Her manicured fingers had trembled only slightly as she dialed, not from fear of consequences, but from anticipation of the chaos she was about to unleash. The SWAT teams had mobilized within 12 minutes, an impressive response time that would later be cited as evidence of the emergency dispatch system's efficiency. What the officers didn't know was that their urgent mission was based on the calculated revenge of a woman who had never set foot inside St. Jude Hospital, never met any of its staff, and had no knowledge whatsoever of organ trafficking or medical procedures beyond what she'd Googled that afternoon. Karen's war against St. Jude had begun 3 months earlier at a zoning board meeting, where the hospital had requested permission to expand its emergency department. The renovation would have required the demolition of 2 condemned buildings on the adjacent lot, structures that had stood empty for 8 years, their windows boarded up and walls covered in graffiti. The city had already approved the demolition, viewing it as urban renewal that would beautify the neighborhood. But Karen Morrison saw something different in those crumbling buildings. As the newly appointed liaison for Metro Health Systems, the largest private hospital conglomerate in the Southeast, she recognized an opportunity to eliminate competition. Metro Health had been eyeing the East Atlanta healthcare market for years, deterred only by St. Jude's stubborn refusal to be acquired and its inexplicable ability to provide quality care at prices that made private healthcare executives wake up in cold sweats. The expansion of this so-called community hospital will strain city resources. Karen had argued at the zoning meeting, her voice carrying the polished authority of someone who had attended the best schools and networked at the right country clubs. We must consider the traffic impact, the noise pollution, and the precedent this sets for allowing medical facilities to sprawl unchecked through residential neighborhoods. Dr. St. Jude, now 78 and using a walking cane, had stood slowly to address the board. Mrs. Morrison, with respect, the only thing that will strain city resources is more people dying because they can't afford health care. We've performed over 12,000 surgeries in the past 5 years, saving the city millions in emergency transport costs to distant hospitals. Our expansion will add 32 beds and reduce emergency wait times by 40%. The old doctor's words had carried the weight of decades spent watching families choose between medical care and keeping their homes. He spoke of teenage diabetics rationing insulin, of heart attack patients driving themselves to the hospital because ambulance bills could bankrupt a working family, of cancer patients giving up treatment rather than leaving medical debt to their children. Karen had smiled coldly as she delivered her response. Dr. St. Jude, while your intentions may be admirable, good intentions don't guarantee proper medical standards. Has your facility undergone the same accreditation reviews as established hospitals? Can you certify that your reduced-price surgeries maintain the same quality standards as procedures performed at properly funded institutions? The accusation had hung in the air like poison gas. Several board members shifted uncomfortably, suddenly questioning whether they should support a hospital that charged less. If the prices were lower, the reasoning went, perhaps the care was substandard. Karen had planted the seed of doubt with surgical precision. Dr. Williams, who had attended the meeting to support the expansion, felt his jaw tighten. St. Jude's surgical success rates exceeded those of Metro Health's flagship facility, a fact easily verified through publicly available data. Their infection rates were lower, their patient satisfaction scores higher, and their readmission rates among the best in the state. The difference wasn't quality, it was profit margin. Our accreditation is current and comprehensive, Dr. Williams had said, standing to address Karen directly. We maintain the same standards as any major medical center, but we don't add administrative fees for every aspirin or charge $500 for procedures that cost $20 to perform. We practice medicine, Mrs. Morrison, not extortion. The zoning board had ultimately approved St. Jude's expansion by a narrow vote of 4-3. But Karen Morrison left that meeting with something more valuable than victory, a complete understanding of her enemy's vulnerabilities, and a burning desire to destroy them. Over the following weeks, she had systematically researched ways to undermine the hospital's reputation and financial stability. She'd attended community health fairs with a notepad, documenting every minor inefficiency she could observe. She'd reviewed online patient reviews, looking for complaints she could amplify. She'd even hired a private investigator to dig into the personal lives of key staff members, searching for scandals that could be weaponized. What she'd found instead was a depressingly clean record of dedicated professionals who worked longer hours for lower pay because they believed in serving their community. Dr. Williams coached Little League on weekends. Dr. Rivera had spent her vacation time setting up free clinics in rural communities. The head nurse, Patricia Washington, had organized supply drives for homeless shelters using her own network of contacts. The investigation had cost Karen $8,000 and yielded nothing more than proof that St. Jude Community Hospital was exactly what it claimed to be, a medical facility, genuinely committed to providing quality health care, regardless of patients' ability to pay. For someone whose entire worldview was built around the assumption that everyone had ulterior motives and hidden agendas, this discovery was both infuriating and incomprehensible. If she couldn't destroy them with truth, she would destroy them with lies. The false 911 report was just the beginning. Karen had spent weeks researching the most inflammatory accusations she could level against a hospital, settling on organ trafficking because it combined medical complexity with emotional horror. Most importantly, it was nearly impossible to disprove quickly. Even if the allegations were eventually shown to be false, the damage to the hospital's reputation would be irreversible. She had timed the call perfectly, knowing that multiple surgeries were scheduled for the early morning hours when the hospital operated with minimal administrative staff. The fewer witnesses to the initial SWAT response, the easier it would be to control the narrative through carefully placed media contacts. By 3:15 a.m., as tactical officers continued to hold surgical teams at gunpoint while they secured the operating rooms, Amara Henderson's heart had stopped beating. The 8-year-old girl, who had been born with a congenital defect that required surgical correction, became the first casualty of Karen's revenge plot. Her mother would learn of her daughter's death not from a doctor's gentle explanation, but from the chaotic shouts of officers demanding that everyone remain calm while they investigated reports of criminal activity. In Operating Room 3, Dr. Rivera's 62-year-old patient suffered a massive stroke when his brain surgery was halted mid-procedure. The tumor removal had been proceeding smoothly, with Dr. Rivera carefully working around critical neural pathways that controlled speech and motor function. The forced interruption left bleeding vessels unrepaired and brain tissue exposed to infection. Within 20 minutes, Harold Washington had slipped into a coma from which he would never recover. The third casualty occurred in the cardiac unit, where a 47-year-old construction worker named Miguel Santos was undergoing emergency surgery to repair damage from a heart attack he'd suffered on a job site. The delay in his procedure resulted in massive cardiac tissue death, leaving him with permanent heart failure that would require expensive ongoing treatment his family couldn't afford. By dawn, St. Jude Community Hospital had experienced its darkest hour in over 2 decades of operation. 2 patients were dead, 1 was permanently disabled, and 4 others had suffered complications that would extend their recovery times and increase their medical costs exponentially. The SWAT team had found no evidence of organ trafficking, illegal surgery, or any criminal activity whatsoever. What they had found was exactly what the hospital staff had been telling them all along: dedicated medical professionals trying to save lives. The news crews arrived as the sun painted Atlanta's skyline in shades of orange and gold. Karen had made 3 more calls that morning, this time to local television stations and newspaper reporters. She didn't identify herself, but she provided detailed information about the ongoing investigation at St. Jude, emphasizing the involvement of SWAT teams and the serious nature of the allegations under investigation. This is a developing story out of East Atlanta, where federal agents raided St. Jude Community Hospital following reports of possible organ trafficking. Channel 7's morning anchor announced, standing in front of the hospital with police vehicles visible in the background. We're told that several surgeries were interrupted during the investigation, and there are unconfirmed reports of patient casualties. The phrase "unconfirmed reports of patient casualties" would be repeated across news networks throughout the day, each iteration adding new layers of speculation and implied guilt. By noon, social media was flooded with theories about the illegal organ ring that had been exposed at the community hospital. The fact that no evidence of wrongdoing had been found was buried in the final paragraphs of news articles, while headlines screamed about death and federal investigations. Dr. St. Jude sat in his office that afternoon, staring at the obituary photo of Amara Henderson that someone had already posted online. The little girl smiled back at him from the computer screen, wearing a school uniform and holding a drawing of a rainbow. Her mother had shared the image on social media with a simple message, "My angel earned her wings today." She wanted to be a doctor when she grew up, just like the ones who tried to save her. The old doctor's hands shook as he reached for his phone to call the hospital's attorney. In 43 years of practicing medicine, he had never lost a patient due to anything other than medical necessity. The weight of knowing that Amara and Harold had died because someone had deliberately sabotaged their care was crushing his spirit in ways that decades of financial struggle never had. Dr. Williams found him there an hour later, slumped in his chair with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. The younger doctor had spent the morning fielding calls from reporters, medical board investigators, and hospital accreditation agencies. Each conversation had been a fresh assault on his sanity, as he was forced to explain repeatedly that no, they were not running an organ trafficking ring. And yes, patients had died because their surgeries were interrupted by a SWAT team responding to false allegations. "Marcus," Dr. St. Jude whispered, his voice barely audible, "I think they're going to shut us down." The prediction proved accurate. By the end of the week, the Georgia Department of Public Health had launched a comprehensive investigation into St. Jude's practices. The medical board had placed the hospital under enhanced supervision, and 3 major insurance companies had suspended their contracts pending resolution of the federal investigation. The hospital's charity care program was immediately frozen, and all elective surgeries were postponed indefinitely. Most devastating of all was the mass resignation of nursing staff, who could no longer afford to work for a facility that might not exist in 6 months. Patricia Washington, the head nurse who had dedicated 18 years to St. Jude, submitted her resignation with a letter that brought tears to Dr. St. Jude's eyes. "I believe in this hospital's mission, but I have 3 children who depend on me, and I can't risk their security for an institution that may not survive this attack. I'm sorry. Dr. St. Jude, I'm so very sorry." Karen Morrison watched the hospital's destruction unfold from the safety of her home in Buckhead, a sprawling mansion in one of Atlanta's most exclusive neighborhoods. She had moved there 6 months earlier, after Metro Health's board had approved her hiring with a substantial signing bonus, recognizing her expertise in competitive market analysis and strategic expansion planning. Her official title was Director of Community Relations, but her real job was identifying and neutralizing obstacles to Metro Health's growth ambitions. The attack on St. Jude had exceeded her most optimistic projections. Within 2 weeks of the SWAT raid, the hospital had lost 60% of its patient volume, as families who had once driven hours to receive affordable care began seeking treatment elsewhere. Emergency rooms at other hospitals reported a surge in uninsured patients, many of whom were turned away or given minimal treatment before being discharged with enormous bills they couldn't pay. Karen documented these developments in detailed reports to Metro Health's executive committee, framing the collapse of St. Jude as evidence of natural market forces eliminating an inefficient competitor. She made no mention of her role in initiating the hospital's destruction, presenting herself as a skilled analyst who had simply predicted an inevitable outcome. Her success at St. Jude earned her a promotion and a substantial raise. The board was so impressed with her market analysis that they assigned her to evaluate 2 other community hospitals in neighboring states, both of which posed similar threats to Metro Health's expansion plans. Karen began developing new strategies for eliminating these competitors, each more sophisticated than the false emergency report that had worked so effectively in Atlanta. What she didn't anticipate was the growing network of healthcare workers who refused to accept St. Jude's destruction as an isolated incident. Dr. Williams had spent countless hours researching similar attacks on community hospitals across the Southeast, discovering a troubling pattern of regulatory investigations, media campaigns, and financial pressures that consistently benefited large healthcare conglomerates like Metro Health. His breakthrough came when he connected with Dr. Lisa Chen, an emergency physician whose rural hospital in Alabama had been shut down 2 years earlier, following a series of suspicious complaints and regulatory challenges. Dr. Chen had documented her facility's destruction in meticulous detail, creating a timeline that showed how calculated attacks could be used to eliminate competition in the healthcare market. The playbook is always the same. Dr. Chen explained during a video conference with Dr. Williams and representatives from 5 other embattled community hospitals. First, they challenge your expansion or renovation plans through zoning and regulatory channels. If that doesn't work, they start a whisper campaign about quality and safety. Then comes the false emergency that triggers a regulatory response, followed by media coverage that destroys public confidence. Dr. Williams felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place as he listened to Dr. Chen's presentation, the woman who had opposed St. Jude's expansion at the zoning board meeting, the one who had questioned their medical standards, matched descriptions of individuals who had appeared at similar meetings in other cities, where community hospitals had subsequently closed under mysterious circumstances. Working with a team of investigative journalists and healthcare advocacy lawyers, Dr. Williams began building a comprehensive case file that documented Karen Morrison's activities across multiple states. Phone records showed calls placed from her number to emergency services and media outlets in each city where attacks had occurred. Financial records revealed payments from Metro Health to private investigation firms that had conducted surveillance on targeted hospitals. Most damning of all were internal Metro Health emails that had been leaked by a whistleblower within the company's executive leadership. The messages showed explicit discussions about eliminating community hospital competition through regulatory challenges and reputation management campaigns. Karen's name appeared throughout the communications as the point person for these operations, with regular progress reports and strategy discussions that treated the destruction of healthcare access for low-income communities as a routine business objective. The evidence was so overwhelming that federal prosecutors had no choice but to act. Karen Morrison was arrested at her home on a Tuesday morning in October, 6 months after her false 911 call had triggered the SWAT raid at St. Jude. The charges included filing false emergency reports, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud, and civil rights violations related to denying medical care to protected populations. Her arrest made national news, not because of her individual crimes, but because of what her case revealed about systematic efforts to eliminate affordable healthcare options across the United States. Healthcare workers from dozens of hospitals came forward with similar stories, creating a pattern of evidence that shocked even veteran prosecutors who had thought they'd seen every type of corporate malfeasance. Karen's trial began 8 months later in federal court in Atlanta, the same city where her false accusations had killed Amara Henderson and Harold Washington. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered by Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Rodriguez, a former healthcare attorney who had left private practice specifically to prosecute cases involving medical fraud and abuse. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Rodriguez began, standing before a packed courtroom that included representatives from healthcare advocacy groups, community hospital administrators, and families affected by hospital closures across the Southeast. This case is about the deliberate destruction of healthcare access for the most vulnerable members of our society. The defendant didn't use a weapon to kill Amara Henderson and Harold Washington. She used something far more insidious: the systematic abuse of emergency response systems and regulatory processes designed to protect public health. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Expert witnesses testified about the medical consequences of interrupting surgeries, with cardiac surgeons explaining in graphic detail why stopping mid-procedure virtually guaranteed patient death or permanent disability. Emergency services officials testified about the resources wasted responding to false reports, and the dangerous delays this created for genuine emergencies occurring simultaneously across the city. Most powerfully, the families of Karen's victims testified about the human cost of her actions. Amara Henderson's mother, Maria, spoke through an interpreter as she described her daughter's dreams of becoming a doctor and her excitement about helping other sick children. Harold Washington's son read a letter his father had written before the surgery, expressing gratitude for the doctors at St. Jude who had agreed to treat him despite his inability to pay up front. Karen's defense team, led by one of Atlanta's most expensive criminal attorneys, argued that their client was a dedicated healthcare professional who had genuinely believed she was reporting suspected criminal activity. They portrayed her as a whistleblower who had been unfairly prosecuted for trying to protect patients from potential harm. The defense strategy crumbled when prosecutors introduced the leaked Metro Health emails, showing Karen's systematic campaign against multiple community hospitals. Internal communications revealed her boasting about the effectiveness of false emergency reports in triggering regulatory investigations that could shut down competitors within months. One email, sent 3 days after the St. Jude raid, was particularly damaging. The SWAT response exceeded expectations and created exactly the media environment we needed to destroy public confidence. 2 patient deaths will make it impossible for them to recover their reputation. Recommend similar approach for the North Carolina target, but suggest organ trafficking allegations rather than drug distribution, as these generate more sustained media attention. The trial lasted 6 weeks, with testimony from over 40 witnesses and the introduction of thousands of pages of documentary evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 8 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. When the foreman read the verdict, the courtroom erupted in applause from healthcare workers who had traveled from across the country to witness the proceedings. Karen Morrison's sentencing hearing took place 3 months later, on a cold February morning that seemed to match the defendant's emotional state as she sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit. Federal Judge Margaret Chen, a former prosecutor who had specialized in healthcare fraud cases, had spent weeks reviewing victim impact statements and legal precedents as she prepared to impose sentence. "Mrs. Morrison," Judge Chen began, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority accumulated over 25 years on the bench. "Your crimes represent a particularly heinous form of fraud, because they weaponized systems designed to protect public safety against the very people those systems were meant to serve. You didn't steal money or property. You stole lives, dreams, and hope from families who had nowhere else to turn for medical care. The judge's words hung in the silent courtroom as she continued. Amara Henderson was 8 years old when she died because you decided that a community hospital's existence threatened your employer's profits. Harold Washington worked construction for 37 years, building homes and schools and churches for his community. But when he needed medical care, your false accusations ensured that he died on an operating table, surrounded by chaos, instead of the healing environment he deserved. Judge Chen sentenced Karen to 27 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole, the maximum allowed under federal sentencing guidelines. She also ordered the forfeiture of all assets Karen had acquired through her illegal activities, including her Buckhead mansion, luxury vehicles, and investment accounts totaling over $3 million. The forfeited assets were placed in a victim compensation fund that would provide ongoing medical care for patients affected by Karen's actions, including Miguel Santos, whose heart failure required expensive treatment that his family couldn't afford. The fund also supported the families of Amara Henderson and Harold Washington, helping to cover funeral expenses and providing college scholarships in their names. More importantly, Karen's conviction led to federal legislation that made filing false emergency reports against healthcare facilities a federal crime punishable by up to 30 years in prison. The Henderson-Washington Patient Protection Act also established enhanced penalties for anyone who used regulatory processes to target healthcare facilities serving low-income communities. St. Jude Community Hospital reopened 18 months after the SWAT raid, with renewed support from the community and a federal grant that helped fund the expansion that had originally triggered Karen's wrath. Dr. Williams was named the new chief of surgery, while Dr. St. Jude remained as chairman emeritus. His faith in healthcare as a human right restored by the outpouring of support from across the country. The hospital's main lobby now features a memorial garden dedicated to Amara Henderson and Harold Washington, with their photographs surrounded by flowering plants that bloom year-round. Below their images, a bronze plaque bears a simple inscription, "In memory of lives lost to greed, and in honor of those who fight to ensure that healthcare remains a human right, not a privilege." Dr. Williams often pauses at the memorial during his rounds, remembering the morning when chaos erupted in his operating room and changed the course of his life forever. The weight of that day never fully leaves him, but it has been transformed from a burden of guilt into a source of determination to ensure that no other community hospital falls victim to the kind of calculated destruction that Karen Morrison had perfected. On quiet nights, when the hospital runs smoothly and patients recover in peace, he sometimes allows himself to imagine a different world where Amara Henderson grew up to become the doctor she dreamed of being, where Harold Washington lived to see his grandchildren graduate from college, where healthcare remained a healing profession rather than a battlefield for corporate profits. It's a world that doesn't exist, but one that dedicated healthcare workers continue to build, one patient at a time, one community at a time, one victory against greed at a time. The story of St. Jude Community Hospital became a rallying cry for healthcare advocates nationwide, proof that communities could fight back against systematic efforts to eliminate affordable medical care. Karen Morrison's name became synonymous with the worst impulses of healthcare corporatization, a cautionary tale about what happens when profit becomes more important than human life. In her federal prison cell, Karen sometimes watches news reports about St. Jude's reopening and the lives being saved there every day. She sees Dr. Williams performing the same types of surgeries that she had interrupted, saving children like Amara Henderson, who would have died without access to affordable cardiac care. The sight fills her with something she had never experienced before her conviction: genuine remorse for the destruction she had caused. But remorse couldn't bring back the dead or undo the damage she had inflicted on countless communities across the Southeast. Karen Morrison would serve every day of her 27-year sentence, a living reminder that some crimes against humanity carry consequences that last a lifetime. The families she had destroyed, the hospitals she had closed, the patients who had died because of her greed would forever stand as testament to the human cost of treating healthcare as a commodity rather than a fundamental human right. St. Jude Community Hospital continues to serve its community today, stronger and more resilient than ever before. The attack that was meant to destroy it instead revealed the depth of community support for accessible healthcare and the lengths that dedicated professionals will go to preserve it. In examining rooms and surgical suites where Karen Morrison had tried to sow chaos and death, doctors and nurses continue their healing work, guided by the simple principle that Dr. St. Jude had established decades earlier: they save lives. Not bank accounts, not shareholders' profits, but lives. And in that mission, they have found a purpose that no amount of corporate greed can ever destroy.